Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Hey everyone, Brian here. Just a quick introduction for today's episode. We are continuing with the content from the HERS conference that we recorded as a live event back in March. And so this particular episode is going to be the first of a 3-part on the Risk Summit. We did this as a single hour-and-a-half long session at the HERS conference, but we decided to break it up into 3 pieces. First of all, it became pretty natural to divide them up this way. And secondarily, we didn't want to drop a hour-and-a-half long episode on you all. So we're going to stretch this out across 3 different weeks. We'll do this in subsequent weeks here, with this week's being the first one. The first part is going to be exclusively Milou and I talking. Milou's going to introduce the concept of a risk summit and kind of the importance of risk officers and how all of these pieces are going to tie together. And then she'll bring me on to run through the very first of 5 different scenarios. And so you'll see us kind of work out how we want to do this, which the others will follow through on. And that'll be the first episode. So then the second and third episode will be going through other aspects of risk assessment and trying to kind of work out how a risk officer would approach working with people like you in the IT and the security and the CEO suite, those types of things, to figure out how best to deal with risk and to score it and prioritize it and all those kinds of things. So really cool content, definitely designed to be listened to or watched, all 3 of them. So definitely watch this one, listen to this one, and make sure that you grab the next 2 weeks after this, and potentially just set them up to listen to all 3 of them. I'll do a quick introduction and outro for each of them just to kind of remind you that they are all working together as a single unit. I'm just kind of divided up a little bit. With that, I'll cut over to Milou and what we did for the Risk Summit at the HERS conference. And do keep in mind that this is one part of a longer series. Enjoy, and we'll talk to you soon.
For me, risk management is something that I think a lot of us are aware that it's happening. I think most of us don't actually know how to understand what risk management is. And so I've done some incredible work in the information security space on business continuity, disaster recovery planning, and something that's known as a tabletop exercise, where we literally are supposed to get together at a tabletop and basically do a fake scenario. I haven't seen that done with risk except for how I do this with my clients. And so something that Compliance Council does, we work in existing tools. So a lot of our teams have governance, risk, and compliance tools. The Compliance Council, we're partners with Vantas, OneTrust, SafeBase, Drata. So we are tool agnostic on the GRC space. So my team, we do work with the existing environments and infrastructure that my clients have and what they want. Also, sometimes we just do stuff in spreadsheets. Now, when we're talking about being a risk officer, that means I'm really good at imagining the doomsday scenario. So unfortunately for me, I don't sleep much because I stay up a lot just thinking about like what's the worst thing that could happen. And fortunately, I was able to figure out how to make that my full-time job. And so things that organizations have to do from a risk perspective is they do have to come up with a risk register, which is ultimately just documented risks that they're either aware of that they want to do something about, or they've just decided like, hey, we are going to acknowledge it and we're going to just see how it goes. What I love about risk management as a thought and function is really every individual organization's risk tolerance is completely different. So what is risky to one business is not risky for another. What makes sense for one company at the time might make 0 sense for a different organization. So Brian and I on Socializing Security on the podcast, we talk very often about risk tolerance and personal risk tolerance, where, I, as a content creator who sometimes posts videos of me dancing on the internet, whatever, like in some type of workspace, is very different than, somebody like Brian might actually show up and like create content. And so there's also this like personal risk, which also means we have something that is just considered perspective. And so when we get together and we all communicate about different perspective and different risk scenarios, I want to just get together today. And again, I'm hopeful that this will be interactive in what's available for the means and methods we're doing. I'm going to talk about the ISO 31000 framework, which is really actually what most risk management programs, whether they're in a tool like Vanta or Drata, are actually based on. It's a qualitative approach. And so they're really trying to actually tie impact and likelihood so that the organization can have some type of actual like quantitative, like substantial understanding of, hey, we think this risk is medium. We think this one's critical. And so actually, we're going to talk about how we actually do that. And so this is something I do with my clients generally on an annual basis, where we get together and we try to get leadership in the room. If they're not available, it's probably not going to be that productive. At the end of the day, most folks within an organization, compliance 100% is going to understand the risk register better than any other team. That does not mean that they should be the only ones that are doing risk. I think that's a shortcoming of a lot of programs, is that the compliance function is the only one in the room, which, I've been there. So I'll say, I'm going to come here as the risk officer. What I've done is to try to bring out 5 subject matter experts to come in and talk through different risks. Again, a risk assessment is ultimately a quantitative approach that sufficiently defines the risk to the business and enables stakeholders to prioritize that. What that means is we're actually documenting something that we're aware of being like, hey, there is a risk that there is shadow IT within the organization, right? Somehow we noticed, we jumped on a call. I've done this before in audit. It's like the best one, where I jumped into an audit and someone was screen sharing, and all of a sudden, they're just showing tools I've never seen before. And so that's something called shadow IT. And so that would be a risk to the business, right? Where we have unauthorized information going into systems that teams like IT have no knowledge of. And so that's a risk to the business that actually could become a really large risk. And so when we're doing, there are a couple of different phases for the risk assessment process. There's identification, evaluation, treatment, and monitoring. What that means is we've identified that there's a risk. Hi, we're seeing that there's shadow IT, right? Then we're going to evaluate, what are we going to do about it? So Anthony, I see him jumping in. He and I used to work as IT and compliance together. We would, he and I would probably get into a call and be like, hey, this thing just popped up. What are we actually going to do about it? So then, not only have we identified it, we've evaluated that it is a risk. We're starting to actually score some type of thing of how much time, effort, and budget do we need to actually allocate for this? And then we're going to treat it. And then the thing that a lot of companies forget is that we do need to monitor risks. So just because we treat it at one time does not mean that shadow IT is not going to pop up later. So I think that's kind of the way that it works. So we've got identification, evaluation, treatment, and monitoring. Today in our sessions, we're going to be bringing on experts, and they're really going to be walking through treatment. So we're going to be talking about, they're going to raise the risk. They're going to walk us through a scenario. And then they're either, again, I hope we can be interactive with this, and otherwise I'll be the one kind of prompting questions. But the goal is that we can kind of then just be asking, like, how are we actually going to handle this? What are controls that we could actually put in place to fix these things? So when we talk about treatment, there are a few different approaches that we can take. We can avoid a risk completely, which means as an organization, right, we're going to say we're going to lock down the machines so well with mobile device management, as well as with different, controlled browsers, to make sure that somebody cannot download a random app, and use it on their workstation, right? That's how we're going to fully avoid the risk. It's probably pretty unlikely. I'll say that. It's really rare that I've seen a risk actually be fully avoided, except maybe where an organization wants to expand into a country and they've decided that the legal risk isn't worth it. And so they're going to avoid that and pivot from that decision. Retaining the risk is quite common, especially for startups. So this one is tough because you can retain a risk for a certain amount of time. Auditors aren't going to love that. And your compliance function's also not going to love that. If y'all are aware of certain things like people sharing passwords, for example, that is not a risk that you should just retain. There are certain risks that, will bubble up. And also later on, if you are in an investigation or you've done something really wrong, the authorities are also not going to love that you were adamantly aware that something was wrong and your department or your team decided not to do anything about it. So I would say if you're going to retain risks, you should make pretty clear documentation on why your company has decided to justify to being like, we do not have the time, energy, resources, power to fix this issue. but we want to. And so those, again, are notes that you should be updating. Most likely quarterly is the best approach I've generally seen. I think once a year is way too slow, especially with the rise of AI. I think it's way too slow. So coming in and just like updating, if you are retaining, if there's a known risk to the business that you're like, hey, we cannot fix this right now, definitely coming up with regular plans and making sure that compliance is empowered to continue to just repeat that and ask for help and clarification. Then again, my favorite is we're going to reduce the risk. So we're going to be aware that something like shadow IT is there, and we're going to make sure that we empower a team like IT to get the type of budget, spend, and resources to fix it so that we're going to mitigate the risk. So ultimately, if it's a high risk to the organization, we're hoping that we're going to get it down to a low. And then again, we are still going to monitor that to make sure that our treatment was effective a year later, 2 years later, and so on. The last option is transferring the risk, which means we're sharing the risk. That comes up a little bit differently. Generally, we see that as like when you bring on insurance. So, if you're taking on like cyber insurance, right, then you're going to transfer that risk of having to potentially pay out on a claim for a security incident, where you're going to be transferring that risk to the insurance company and they are going to help you. That one comes up a little bit less often, but again, it's, there being the potential risk of a data breach, we're going to transfer that and share that risk with the cyber insurance company. All right, I think we can move on to the next one. When we're talking about risk scoring, this is actually the most important part of the conversation, where we're really going to tie the likelihood that a thing is going to happen, and we're going to do that on a 1 to 5 basis, and we're going to multiply that by the impact to the business. And what's cool about this is, again, this is the framework that is based off of ISO 31000, and so this is completely individualized for every company. And so the business impact for a small firm, those financial numbers are going to look very different than a large enterprise, right? So it's making sure that your risk scoring methodology continues to also understand the actual environment that the risk program sits in, of making sure that it's also growing with the company ideally. So by doing that, there are 4 different levels, right? There's low, medium, high, and critical. Critical risk should almost be treated like 100% of the time. I'd be really shocked if you're going to pass an audit if you have a critical risk just like sitting open. It's just very unlikely. It's something that, the higher the risk, the more scrutiny you're going to get under audit or by people like me. So those are the ones you should definitely have the best treatment on. And I think it's a really great place to start when we're focusing on that. When we talk about treatment stage, again, we had already kind of talked about identification, evaluation, treatment, and monitoring. Again, when we're talking about the treatment status, I think it's really just understanding the awareness that we're going to have low is going to be under 6. And this is that multiplication table, which this is the ISO 31000 framework. This is actually risk management. So when you hear somebody's talking about risk and what a compliance officer is supposed to be doing, or the risk officer, whoever is kind of holding that seat, is they should be taking, if something comes up like shadow IT, they should understand what's the likelihood of it happening. Usually it's a baseline of, how often has this happened over the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? That is the trigger that you should actually customize for your organization. Just because the baseline is once in every 10 years, I think that's actually probably too broad of a range now. I think even my slides need to be updated over the last 3 years. It also depends on the age of the business, right? If it's an organization that has a huge institution and a lot of knowledge behind it, they're going to have a way better understanding of what likelihood is, and also how often something is happening to the business. So again, that one is relatively straightforward, and you do tie 1 through 5 number to it. Business impact is totally customizable. And so again, this is where you're going to actually see financial numbers. So what is the cost of the business of this bad thing, this scary thing happening? And so those, again, these numbers are customized. This is probably at a mid-size organization where a critical risk is 7.5 million. Me as a small business owner, that would be my worst day. So my risk table for my organization of what I feel comfortable taking on as a business owner is going to look very different than this table. And so that's what's really empowering. You should customize this. This is also something, as a part of your annual risk reviews, you should be looking with the leadership team and making sure, they're ultimately going to have the best baseline of what makes sense for them of, is this still truly critical, or should we move those numbers a little bit and rescore the risks based off of that? Okay, that's risk management in an 8-minute 101, I think. So to do this in practice, I don't want to talk this whole session. I'm actually really grateful. I brought on 5 incredible leaders to actually come and talk with us. So of course, Brian is getting roped into the first one, but we are going to have Brian Knutson join We're going to have Robert Hug join us virtually, as well as then we're going to have Eliza White-Blum, we're going to have Paul Lammers, and we're going to have Sophie Lammers. There are a lot of Lammers on this session, which is really fun. So I happen to have some really incredible family members that are also just like super smart human beings. So they're going to come. We do look alike because we are family members, but Brian, I think at this point is basically an honorary member. So Brian, why don't you come join us and we're going to talk about a 0-day infrastructure failure. Do you actually want to give an overview of what you do?
I do a lot of things. IT has been in my background the entire time, but I've done the actual administration side of things. I've done development. I've done marketing. I've done sales. So yeah, a little bit of everything. Today, I'm primarily focused on marketing type activities.
Yeah. And then we have a podcast.
And there's a podcast in there somewhere.
Okay, so we are now wearing our risk officer hat. And so this would be really where, as the risk officer, I would be bringing somebody in like Brian to really, like, in the worst case failure, also identify what he thinks are the largest risks to the business. And ideally, he's going to be the one that's helping me fix it if something breaks.
Yep. So in this scenario, I'm acting as an IT leader, and helping to make sure that any risks around IT going away, which of course is pretty detrimental to most businesses these days, is going to be effective. So how do you want to start?
Why don't you read your scenario?
Read the scenario? Okay. So do you want a dramatic reading?
Oh, yes, please.
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay.
100% of the time.
Okay. Put on my dad hat. Here we go. It's a chaotic Monday outage. At 6:40 a.m. on Monday morning, monitoring alerts begin triggering for the infrastructure team before you've even had a chance to think of your morning coffee. A widely used open source library embedded in several core services has just disclosed a critical 0-day vulnerability. Security researchers report that the exploitation is already occurring in the wild. Within an hour, 1, your production systems begin failing health checks. 2, customer-facing APIs start returning errors. 3, engineers report that patching requires rebuilding a major portion of the service stack. And 4, customers in multiple regions are already reporting outages. There are several complicating factors. First of all, we have no patch that currently exists because this is a 0-day vulnerability. Our SaaS environment runs on a dependency chain where multiple vendors use the same vulnerable component. And finally, our security team is still determining whether exploitation occurred in the environment or not. So, do you want me to start reading the prompts too?
Hell yeah. Let's
Okay.
Just kind of sounds like your worst nightmare.
Yeah, this is a bad day in IT, and generally it is going to start outside of business hours.
Yeah.
Friday at 2 a.m. on the day after Thanksgiving is very common attack time because it is going to result in the slowest response. Now, at this point, we don't really even know if there's an attack going on. We just know that there's a big giant hole in the wall that people can come into. First off, we have to ask ourselves, what is the risk to the business? And I'm big on focusing on the business side of it, not just the IT side of it. So IT, sometimes we sit in our little bubble and we don't think about things beyond that. But a critical vulnerability in a widely used open source component causes a widespread system failures and potentially exploitation before patches are available. So having that vulnerability in there means that we're going to be hitting a lot of places, especially when it's common software piece that's used in a lot of different products. This risk may lead to service disruptions, potentially compromise of systems, or emergency infrastructure changes or in operational instability. So there's going to be a lot of changes going on. There's going to be a lot of chaos. There's going to be a lot of not knowing if it's a problem. And ideally, what we can do at that point is to start understanding what the problems could be and assessing them and watching them for the potential exploitations. To do these one at a time or just keep going?
No, keep going. I mean,
going,
you
okay.
take a break for sure. Like, you can breathe for a second, but okay. So yes, this is the 0-day critical failure. This is quite likely. So I guess maybe walk us through likelihood on this one. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this happens all the time. We've seen it multiple times. Those of you in IT, I think the premier one that I think really hit us all first as to how the supply chain that's described here, it's not software I necessarily bought, but it's software that my software uses, is the Log4j vulnerability. So that was a huge vulnerability. It didn't necessarily take systems out per se, but it was a common place where people looked at it and said, wow, we're potentially going to get attacked through something like this. We've seen CrowdStrike introduce a similar type of scenario where everything just goes away. In that case, it was truly things went away. Didn't really expose the environment to an attacker, but did make it a situation where things were out of business at that point. So next we think about how are we going to treat this risk? Like Milou said, we can avoid the risk, we can mitigate the risk, we can accept it, or we can transfer it. And this is a very business by business specific decision to make, because in a manufacturing plant, if this vulnerability is inside of our OT network, our operational technology network, where our machines that are doing things are going to be affected, that's a really big deal. But if it happens in the email system, where traditionally we don't conduct business directly through email, it's more internal communication. It may be coordinating lunch with some buyer that we want to meet with. No big deal. Like if that goes down for a few days, it's not going to affect the bottom line of the business, as opposed to that OT system where no operational technology means no creating new widgets, which means no income is coming in. First off is like, what is it really affecting on the business is one of the very first things to figure out and decide if we want to just accept it. Is probably not okay in a OT environment, but it's probably a really big deal when we get into, or is a big deal in an OT environment, and it's not a big deal when we get to email.
What do you mean by OT environment?
Operational technology. Okay. So that's the manufacturing floor. I did define it though.
You did. I probably just blanked out for a second. All right, let's walk through then. Again, we're going to go through the traditional methodology. So we're going to talk through impact and likelihood. So likelihood is first. And again, please y'all in the chat, like please definitely jump in here on, especially on the scoring for this. We really want this to be interactive as opposed to, I mean, Brian and I would like to just like talk.
We're too good at it.
But, what do we actually think the likelihood is that this is going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, these things happen all the time. So I'd say it's very likely in this case. Every IT operation is eventually going to get hit with something like this. So it's definitely one to be prepared for and not assume it's not going to happen.
All right, so I'm going to push you then. Are we thinking this is possible, or is it a 3? Is it a 4? Is it absolutely certainly like happening a 5?
I would say it is at least a 4. It's more than possible. It's likely. Is it absolutely going to happen? I would argue that it probably would, but that is where I would allow the discussion would be between the 4 and the 5.
All right, so y'all weigh in the chat. Do we think it sounds like we're thinking it's a 4. We think this is a very likely possible scenario that this 0-day failure is going to happen. Ultra dramatic pause here. I'm going to call people out. Yeah, I was about to be like, oh, Steve, please.
Oh, Steve's
I was about to be like, Steve is going to jump in. All right, we've got Rob saying a 4, Jess saying a 4. Steve is still ferociously typing.
He's going to do something to make us laugh.
Pretty reasonable expectation for a 0 day. Yeah. Okay, all right. So we think it's likely.
Yeah, at least.
That inherently almost automatically says that this is going to be a high risk to the business.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Okay, and then let's talk through kind of the actual financial harm. Again, this one is hard because we're not doing like a theoretical company, but if you were pitching this kind of in general.
Yeah, I mean, this one's a lot harder to pin down. It's not nearly as certain because where it hits, what it hits could make a big difference. As I mentioned before, between the OT and the email, for example. So this one's a lot harder to pin down. It's much more undefined. So we'd really have to dig into those potential systems and really understand kind of what our minimum viable business is a term I've been using a lot in my day job, around which systems are the most critical. And those systems that are the most critical generally are more directly tied to revenue numbers, which means that as we have outages in those systems, those are the systems that, okay, well, yeah, if I don't have email and business is not directly conducted through email, therefore it's going to be minimal money impact. But if it's our Salesforce instance that goes down for some reason, or whatever customer management we might be using, that's going to be a much bigger number. So I think this one's much more isolated to the system than even the last one was. I can't give you an exact number, sorry.
So this, as a risk officer here, again, if ideally somebody that's in the room, right, it's like a stakeholder and a leader, a subject matter expert like Brian, as well as then finance absolutely needs to be in the room, the leadership team team needs to be in the room, and then IT as well, of just actually helping to figuring out like, hey, we think that these critical systems, we think, if we had a 0-day failure and it lasted a day, it lasted 3 days, it lasted a week, right? Like that is the worst case scenario for a tech company, to be able to just like not service their customers for a week. So coming up with what that is, so we can maybe say like moderate business disruption. We're going to think, we've kind of tied this like minimal impact is less than 50,000, minor operations is 100 to 250,000. We're going to say moderate is 250,000 plus. Major is going to be over $1 million. And then, severe impact is over 5 million for this particular scenario. And so again, I would always say too, as the risk officer, it's really helpful when you're doing risk scoring to being like, hey, this is probably going to be a 3. But if somebody wants to jump in and make solid recommendations to being like, no, this is why it is a 4, or this is why it should be a 2. Because again, what the score of the risk is then what justifies, again, resources, time, and money that's spent on actually fixing it to make it better, which potentially involves adding redundant systems and all of these things. So we'll let Brian kind of talk through kind of how could you fix this?
Yeah. Well, so I guess I've got a question back to you. When I'm so wishy-washy on giving an answer on this one,
Yeah.
is this one where what's the worst possible? What's the average? What's the least possible impact that could be? Like what should I be thinking about as I try to come up with a number for you there?
I think it again, I hate to say it depends, but it really does on this one. I think given it's already basically de facto a 4 on the fact that the impact is, we've all decided it's quite likely that this is going to happen. I think we already know that the organization needs to be investing in reducing like single points of failure here and making sure that they're thinking through how is their infrastructure more redundant in the worst case scenario. We are talking like a doomsday scenario, right? So we are trying to figure out, I think I would be shocked. And I, as compliance and risk officer, have also pushed back occasionally when companies are scoring too low, because also this goes under audit. And if your risks are scored way too lowly, your auditors are like, this is a joke. So to me, this would be a minimum 3.
Yeah, and Steve brought up a good point around the upstream downstream consequences of things. And to that point, then I guess I'm going to take it to the next level and say, okay, well, if this is going to be a 0-day, it's going to introduce the potential for an attacker to get in our environment. They're not just going to attack that one system that was vulnerable. They're going to move laterally. They're going to up their permissions. They're going to try and get to everything. So while this specific 0-day incident may not be huge by itself because it's in some isolated system that doesn't have anything important in it, the potential for them to then go and move into a system that does, to attack my OT, to attack my sales force, to get directly to customer accounts or whatever PII I might have in the environment, that's potentially going to open it up. So in some ways, I guess I can think about it from the same way I would look at, what if I didn't have a firewall and everybody could just walk into our environment? In which case, yeah, I would say we're leaning into a 4 or 5 potentially here too.
Okay, so we picked just like a really critical risk. So, and again, this would be one that ultimately, if it's critical or high, we're going to score it, right? So we're going to take that 4 and we're going to either multiply by that 3 and get a 12, or we're going to be in the 16 to potentially the 20 category. So we're thinking through, this actually gives the organization an initial risk score. And the reason I say initial risk score is there's actually going to be 2. So this is the initial risk score because we've identified this and have had a thoughtful conversation around it. The residual risk score is actually the score we do after we've treated it, after we've actually implemented certain controls. And so you'll see in a risk register, you'll see some of them that have been identified, they've been evaluated, but they haven't been treated yet. So they only have 1 score. And so again, for our conversation today is really to just kind of like walk y'all through what it is to actually evaluate risk. Again, treatment is going to still individually depend on each individual company, but I would expect that this risk should appear in every single company's risk register. So this to me is one that you can definitely use as an example to bring back to your annual risk review and be like, hey, if we don't have the 0-day failure logged in our risk register, we should add it. And we should have this as a thoughtful conversation and take this as an example of like, hey, we can actually walk through this and think through what are controls we could do and make sure you have the right people in the room. I swear, risk management is not just compliance. It is not. Risk is supposed to be throughout the entire organization.
Agreed.
Do you have any last thoughts on your worst day scenario?
I mean, the way to deal with this is preparation. Just like it is for so many things in IT is, all of your defenses. We talked earlier about layers. Like all of those layers have the potential to fail. So, add protections to your protections and redundancies and worst case scenario plans. I do a lot of healthcare, and you end up with if we don't have IT systems, then we need extra people here to run paper from floor to floor for orders.
Their systems fail, people die.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's a really great one to focus on in terms of what industry should have a very different risk tolerance than other ones, because for them, a critical infrastructure failure could take out power.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a scary place to live in healthcare, but
yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, awesome. Thank you so much for being the guinea pig on the first one.
Okay. We hope you enjoyed that look at risk for a 0-day vulnerability situation. Do keep in mind that this is part 1 of 3. So make sure you tune in next week for the second part and kind of keep in mind everything we talked about, because we'll roll directly into the next scenario. So in that situation, we're going to talk about a cloud outage situation, a data center outage situation, as well as a HR focused situation. So tune in next week for the continuation. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.